So this last section, the epidemiology, is a study of disease in population, and we'll look at what is epidemiology, what are the goals, differentiate between or among the various types of reservoirs, providing examples of each, and then differentiate between the 6 different modes of horizontal transmission and hospital-acquired infection, listing the most common types, and list the Koch's postulates and explain alternative methods for identifying the etiologic agent. And then identify some diseases which are notifiable and provide 4 examples of such reportable diseases. Differentiate between the terms incidence and prevalence. Discuss the 3 major types of epidemics and identify the epidemic curves associated with each, and list examples of emerging and re-emerging diseases, infectious disease. So reservoirs are where the pathogens persist. So they are going to be, this is like where you acquire them or where their natural habitat is. So the primary habitat is the reservoir. So it could be a human or an animal carrier, soil or water or plants. That's a reservoir. The source is where you actually got it from, the source from which the infection is acquired. So it could be the same as a reservoir, but it could be distinct. So living reservoirs, so these are the natural habitats, are animals and actively ill humans. So animals can be transmitted directly to humans from animals, can be transmitted from humans via vectors like an insect or an arthropod, can be transmitted through vehicles such as water. So animals can be a living reservoir. Actively ill humans, so someone who has indirect or direct transmission. So a person could come in contact with a pen, and then that is picked up by a healthy person, and that could indirectly transmit the disease. We call that a fomite, and that was another term they used in Contagion. So again, I highly recommend it because this is really, if you haven't seen it, it's a good time to watch that movie. Direct transmission would be a sick person sneezing on a healthy person. So that would be, where there's portals of entry overlapping. That's usually like breathing in your zone that you breathe out and the zone you breathe in. That could be direct transmission. So other living reservoirs, so human carriers, someone who is fully recovered but is shedding the virus, that's another convalescing carrier, and someone who is incubating but doesn't really know that they're infected yet, and they're still able to transmit the virus through sexual contact. That would be an incubating carrier. So there's different names for these carriers. Arthropods are the vectors. It's a lot of times a vector that would be sometimes the reservoir, the host of the pathogen, and it is also sometimes the mode of transmission. So all of these were human and animal reservoirs. A carrier, again, is an individual who is inconspicuously sheltering a pathogen and can spread it without knowledge, can spread it to others without knowing that they have it. So they could be asymptomatic, they could be incubating. So the asymptomatic, they are not showing symptoms. They may never show symptoms, like some sexually transmitted infections are that way. Incubating carriers, they may be too early, but they still are infectious, like infectious mononucleosis. So they may not know that they have the disease. And in the case of infectious mononucleosis, it has a really long incubation period. So you could be incubating for a month and infect a bunch of people and not know it. Convalescing carriers would be those that have recuperated, but they still are able to shed the disease, and the microbe can be spread to others through that period of time. It's like hepatitis A. Chronic carriers are ones that will shed it for the rest of their life, like typhoid fever, and Typhoid Mary was one that had typhoid fever, and she shed that through her life and was able to infect people all the time through the food that she was cooking. And so she'd be like, ooh, did I do that? did I kill that person? And then she would disappear in the middle of the night. So whether she knowingly or unknowingly knew that she was the cause, she was an example of a chronic carrier. And people with tuberculosis can also be chronic carriers. Passive carriers are you, if you work in the healthcare field, and all of the times you pick up things and you touch things, and if you don't hand sanitize all the time in between patients, you can be passing things from one patient to another. So those are all examples of carriers. You may have a question about what type of carrier is being described here. Vectors are not humans. So this is when you have another live animal that's transmitting the infectious agent to another host. So biological vectors are participating in, and this is internal. This is the way I look at it. It's internalized, and they are probably experiencing the disease themselves. So this is internal. Mechanical vectors are externally carrying the disease. So with the internal ones, again, they participate in the pathogen's life cycle. The pathogen can multiply and complete its life cycle within the vector. And so mechanical, though, gets a really misunderstood, it's a misunderstood term because you think of an actual inanimate object with this, and it's not. It's not necessarily necessary to the life cycle, and it is usually being transported without being infected. So it's not inside. Without being infected, infected means it's inside you, right? So it's externally being carried. Like a roach will pick up stuff from poop and then it'll go over to another place, or a fly will pick up stuff from poop and will carry it over to your food and then lands on your food and it carries the microbes to your food. Think about that the next time you have a picnic. So the two examples, like, well, several examples. So like a mosquito, a bat, a chicken, they are all biological vectors because they're infected, where the mechanical vectors like the roach and the fly are not infected. So you need to be able to explain the difference between biological and mechanical and give examples. And that is an essay question on the test. So zoonosis means it's an infection indigenous to animals, but also transmissible to humans. So it's like transmitted animal to human. So we're animals too, but it's talking about non-animal, non-human animals transmitting it to humans. And COVID is actually an example of this. Rabies, hantavirus, West Nile virus, anthrax, plague, ringworm, toxoplasmosis, tapeworm, even influenza at one point may have been in an animal and be transmitted to humans. So all of those are examples where the human is usually the dead end host. It doesn't contribute to the natural persistence of the microbe, or it could be spread from close associations between humans and animals, like on a farm or something, in an animal industry, like if you're working with a lot of livestock or chickens or something like that, it could be transmitted. And people who are animal oriented, so like a vet, or just they love animals, or outdoor professions, they're at the greater risk for these type of infections. Non-living reservoirs. So we've talked about the living reservoirs, and those are carriers or vectors, and zoonosis, those are all reservoirs. But non-living reservoirs, those other ones were living. Non-living would be water, soil, air, food, and so they're non-living things. And microbes have pretty much adapted to all these different habitats. And if the microbe is in that habitat and you encounter it in its habitat, like in the water or in the soil or in the air, then it could be transmitted to you. So some are opportunists and some are regular pathogens. TB is one that can be directly transmitted to humans when they come into contact with contaminated soil or water or air. So example would be like when you have a tornado, you have a lot of oh, tetanus is what I was thinking. Tetanus is one, you get it from a rusty nail or something. And when they have tornadoes and people are out, helping pick up and clean up and everything, you could come into contact with a rusty nail that contains tetanus. And that then you can actually transmit that to you from the rusty nail. So we've talked about reservoirs, and now we're looking at how they are transmitted. So how do we acquire and transmit infectious agents? So if it's a communicable disease, that means that the infected host can transmit the infectious agent to another host and establish infection in that host. Contagious means it's highly communicable. So it's not exactly the same thing, but it just means that if it's contagious, it's highly communicable, like chickenpox is highly communicable. Measles is highly communicable. Non-communicable does not arise through transmission from an infectious agent from host to host. So does not arise from host to host transmission. So, and an example of non-communicable would be like cancer. Typically, we don't think of cancer as being a communicable disease. And C. diff infections, we don't typically think of that as being a communicable disease because it arises from an endogenous infection. It's like in you already. A yeast infection is usually the result of overuse of antibiotics, and it's wiped out your normal flora, and then this endogenous source, this endogenous microbe, is able to grow out of control. So that's non-communicable. So horizontal versus vertical. Horizontal means it's going from within a population from one infected individual to another. So person to person. So we have direct versus indirect here. And so direct, and that's when you have portals of entry and portals of exit are overlapping. So entry and exit are overlapping. So portals of entry and portals of exit. So if you're within like 1 foot of someone and you sneeze on them, that would be an example. But if you're like more than 6 feet away and you sneeze on some door handle or it's in the air and you breathe it in, that's more indirect. So most of the direct is pretty obvious, like sexually transmitted diseases are direct. Using someone else, so like kissing, sexual contact, those are definitely ones that would be direct. And if you sneeze in someone's face, that's direct. But if you get it from the air, or if you get it from inanimate objects like a fomite, a surface that has the microbe on it, a vehicle transmission like from a vector, that would be indirect. So injections into deeper tissues, that would be another indirect. So vertical transmission is from parent to offspring. And it's not just mom to child. It could be through sperm, but we usually think of this as from across the placenta. So that's a vertical transmission. So vehicle is any inanimate object that is commonly used by humans. An example and a type of vehicle would be a fomite, an inanimate object that harbors the pathogen, so like a pen. In a doctor's office, a pen is the most common fomite. Oral fecal route would be when you have someone who has an infection contaminating food by improper food handling techniques, and then an unsuspecting person ingests it, so that would be an example of oral fecal route. Water and soil also can harbor microbes, so they're inanimate, really, and air. And so contaminated water, contaminated soil, contaminated air, contaminated food, contaminated surfaces, all of those are indirect. So when you have vehicle transmission from person, not